So, as we enter the season of Lent, what I'd like to do is really look at kind of the Old Testament readings as we go and we prepare for it. And I was really thinking I was going to be teaching last week, but then we had a guest speaker. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to back up and cover last week's reading, because that reading from Genesis chapter 2 and 3 is so important for Lent. It really sets the whole stage. And I'm not sure how far I'm going to get through this whole thing, because Genesis 1, 2, and 3 are texts that are just loaded with so much information and content to them that you could spend weeks on these couple chapters. So with that in mind, let's take a look at Genesis chapter 2 and 3 and read these. And one of the things I hope to do as we go through today is kind of break up what we would call domesticated reading. In other words, as we read the Bible, we get used to, oh, this is what the text means. And so as soon as you start reading a story, what happens is your mind goes, oh, I know what this is about, and it checks out. It stops paying attention. So what I'd like to do is kind of break that up a little bit so that the stories become fresh and new for you and can speak in new and more provocative ways. Now, in order to do this, one of the things I want to do this morning is take an approach that's called literary archaeology. In other words, instead of actually digging around in the sands in the Middle East and looking for artifacts, what we want to do is look at the text and see what kind of artifacts are in the text here that help us understand what's taking place there. Now, in order to do this, we need to ask the question, why was this text written? So why was Genesis 1, 2, and 3, why were they written? And contrary to popular opinion, they're not anti-evolutionary texts. They're not texts that are talking about specific moral or various agendas like this. Chapters 1, 2, and 3 are primarily theological texts, but they're also set to serve as an introduction. And what they're introducing is the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of Moses. And what's really interesting is this is always dangerous trying to use one of these guys here, okay? If we kind of plot, so you have Genesis here, then Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, and over here is speed of time. In other words, how much time those texts cover. Genesis 1, 2, and 3 are off the charts. They're up here. In the beginning, God created. You're going back to the beginning. And then it's going to drop down really quickly and hit a slower pace, so that by the time we hit, let's say Noah, in chapter 9, things are slowing down. We're looking at one man and one event. And then by the time we hit chapter 12, with Abraham, things are slowing down even more. And then notice how much the book of Genesis slows down. We're going to go from Abraham to Isaac to Jacob and then to Joseph. And we're going to cover in that period there, we're going to go from chapter 12 to chapter 50. In other words, we're having eternity past all the way up to Noah in 9 chapters. Then by the time we hit chapter 12, we're going to just hit 4 people. And then by the time we hit the book of Exodus, what happens? How many people are we focusing on Exodus to Deuteronomy? 1 person, Moses, from here on. So it really drops to a crawl. So what's the important part in the Pentateuch? The first 5 books of Moses. Where's the weight? Where does the shoe drop for this? It falls over here with the story of Moses. This is where all the attention and everything that is. So this serves as an introduction to set up that. So as we're looking at this, we need to start asking questions about how does it set up this? What's it introduces? What are some of the key literary features in this text? One of the things about Genesis 1, 2, and 3 that's very interesting is it creates all sorts of puzzles and paradoxes. We always like to think, oh, it's didactic teaching. If A, then B, therefore C. And the Jewish writers don't like to do that. They like to go, if A, therefore B, but wait a second, B negates A. And if A, then wait, B doesn't follow from A. What's going on here? And it likes to put things in tension and make you think about it without really often giving an answer. And in fact, a lot of the books, Jonah, the book of Jonah ends with the prophet up on a mountainside looking down on the city that's repented. And the question is, did Jonah ever learn his lesson? Does he repent? Does he ever come to embrace the Ninevites? Does he go down into the city of Nineveh after this phenomenal revival? Or does he turn his back and head back to Israel? We don't know. It forces you as a reader then to supply those answers. And then the third thing that we need to ask is, how is this text related to other texts? Because oftentimes we look at the Bible and we think, oh, this is the book during that time. And we fail to realize that if we were alive, let's say during the time when Genesis was written, this would just be one book in a library shelf. There would be a lot of other books up there. Now, what's really interesting in this regard is starting around 1850 to about 1900, archaeologists began to find all of this incredible information in the Middle East. So one of the first finds they found was the ruins of Assyria, modern-day Nineveh, which ISIS tried to destroy in Mosul. They tried destroying these old palaces and archaeological remains. All this stuff was found about 100 years ago. But the Bible talked about Assyria. We just didn't have any evidence. You know, they thought it was a myth. We know about the Babylonians. We found ruins of the Babylonians, but we haven't found anything about the Assyrians. We know about the Egyptians because we knew about the Egyptian ruins. Nothing about it. So they found the Assyrians. Then they found the Hittites. Then the Akkadians. Then the Hurrians. And the really big find came with the finding of what I love, Sumer, or what we would call Sumer. And these are the Sumerians. And this was an empire that existed from about 3500 BC up to about 1000 BC. It's a 2,500 year long empire. And it's the Babylonians and the Assyrians that really destroyed their empire. Now, what's interesting about this is we have tablets like this one. This is called the Flood Tablet. It's at the British Museum in London. You can go over and look at it if you want. But they found this around 1850. They bring it back. They put it in the British Museum. But it's written in cuneiform. And cuneiform is they would have these pens that have little triangular points on the end of them. And by how you put those little points and push them into the clay, you would make letters. And so that's where they can come up with cuneiform. The Sumerians invented that about 3500 BC. And probably when the Pentateuch, or the books of Moses, were written, this is the same type of writing that the Jewish scribes used as well when they wrote things down. Egyptians used it, the Akkadians used it. I mean, it's a form of alphabet and a form of writing that lasted just from about 3500 BC up to about 500 BC, about a 3,000 year time span. So we think Gutenberg is really cool with the movable text. Whoever did this, really should have gotten his name, copyrighted this or something. But they had this thing in the British Museum, and people were trying to decipher, what is this text all about? And there was a guy in England, I was telling my granddaughter about this and my grandson last night. There was a guy in England named George Smith. He came from a working class family. He got skilled in a trade, and he made banknotes. In other words, he's the guy that sat in the bank with that little tiny stylus and scraped the material out of the printing press sheets that they used for printing banknotes. His name was George Smith, and he was kind of an OCD type character. Every day during break, he would run over to the British Museum, and would study cuneiform tablets or material. Oh, no. All right, thank you. I was just thinking I needed more coffee, but I got it. So, George Smith would run over and study these cuneiform tablets, and he taught himself cuneiform. But this one here, no one had cracked. So for about 3 to 5 years, every lunch he would go over and look at this thing and take down notes and stuff like that. And then one day, all of a sudden, he got it. And he jumped up and he said, I'm the first person in over 3,000 years to read this text. Now, when we get into Genesis chapter 3, well, we may not. We'll see how far we get. I had a punchline to this whole story about the section in Genesis chapter later 2 where it says, Adam and Eve, and they were naked and unashamed. Because when this guy cracks it, okay, you got to imagine, England, 1850 to 1900, the British Museum, which is very stuffy. This guy jumps up and begins to disrobe in the British Library. He's so excited. He's just shedding clothes. And the museum staff had to tackle him and to keep him from getting more indecent in the whole thing there. But why is this tablet so important? Because this tells a very old version of the story of Gilgamesh. And in the story of Gilgamesh, there's an account of the flood. Now, the story here that's from this Assyrian tablet is off and older. This is an Assyrian text. It's off an older text from the Sumerian Empire. And one of the things that we found from digging up archaeological remains from Sumeria is around 3200 BC in Uruk, a city in Sumeria, there was a king by the name of Gilgamesh. So all of a sudden, all these stories and this literature from that time period and the validity of it all of a sudden starts coming together. Now, in order to understand Noah's story, you have to understand how it compares and contrasts with this one. Or, in particular today, what we're looking at is Genesis 1, 2, and 3. And in Genesis chapter 1, oftentimes, because we live in a scientific age today, when we read it, the big question is, oh, is this evolutionary or anti-evolutionary? Does it support a creationist or a non-creationist worldview? And one of the things to realize is that was never in their mindset at all. It wasn't part of their conceptual makeup. So the question here is, what were they thinking when they looked at this text? And primarily, Genesis chapter 1 is a theological text. In other words, when he goes through the 6 days of creation, one of the things that the author says is not just God made the heavens and the earth. What it's saying is God is not in the heavens and God is not in the earth. When he talks about the sea, it says God is not in the sea. When he talks about the animals, God created the animals. God is not in an animal. When it talks about creating man and woman, God is not in a man or a woman. God is completely other, and he is separate from his creation. But here's the really remarkable thing. He works through his creation. And this is the genius of Judaism. Judaism's contribution, what made Judaism survive, is that it had this remarkable idea that God is completely other than creation. He's not in the clouds, he's not in the earth, he's not in the sea, he's not in the animals. God is completely other, but by the same token, God interacts with and works through creation. Because if you look at Judaism, it gets started, let's say it really gets started with Abraham. He's the father of the Jewish nation. So let's put him around 1500, 1600 BC. All right? So with Abraham is a migrant wandering around from country to country, doesn't have a homeland. Then he has four levels of descendants. You end up with Jacob, and they're in slavery in Egypt for 400 years. Now, for any other religion or culture during that time, that would have meant that they would be assimilated into that culture. It'd be then, end of the story. You wouldn't hear anything more about them. They'd be part of Egypt. No. What happens? 400 years later, they come out. Then they get into the promised land. But then what happens? The Assyrians conquer northern Israel, the 10 tribes in the north disappear. Then the Babylonians come, conquer southern, what we call Judea, take them off into slavery in Babylon. And with any other religion, that would have been the end of it. It would have been wiped out. We would be, looking through the sands for little shards or who are these people? Who are these Judeans? Instead, what happens is after the Babylonian captivity, they come back. Then you have the destruction of the land during the Roman period. But it's this idea that God is completely other, that we don't have idols or statues. There's no local deity. There's no storm god we worship. God is completely other in all of creation, above it, but works through it. That then allowed Judaism to thrive and survive through all these various twists and turns. And I would say that's primarily the biggest contribution that Genesis chapter 1 makes, is this introduction and setting up the theology of the book. Now in Genesis chapter 2, we come into Genesis chapter 2, and chapter 2 really should start with verse 4. Because at the beginning of verse 4, we get this statement. These are the generations of the heavens and the earth. Now this phrase, the generations of, I've got it translated down there below. Tadolth, this Hebrew word, this is used numerous times throughout the book of Genesis to kind of say, okay, now we've got a new story. So it starts here, then with Adam's son, Seth, you get the generations of Seth. Then with Noah, you get the generations of Noah. Then with Abraham, you get the generations of Abraham. Then with Isaac and Jacob. So each one of these major stories, major turning points, has an introduction like this in it. Now this one's interesting because instead of talking about the generations of Noah, it talks about the generations of creation. It says, these are the generations of the heavens and the earth when they were created, in the day that the Lord made heaven and earth. Now I was saying that they like to play on words. They also like to really put things in very poetic forms. So look at how they laid this out here. I've got it down there below for you. These are the generations, and it says, of the heavens and the earth when they were created. Now, notice how the author says exactly the same thing, only backwards this time. In the day the Lord made the earth and the heavens. So it's got this very, almost like a psalm type introduction to this section here. And there's a beauty to it that really helps it extend beyond its time. Ah, yes. Then the other thing that we have here is in 2:4 and then 2:5, a contrast. I was saying they like to put two things together and make you wrestle with it. In Genesis chapter 1, it says the earth was without form and void, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. So Genesis 1 gives you this picture of the earth being formless and void, and you've got the Spirit of God moving over the waters. And from a Jewish point of view, theologically in the Old Testament, the seas and the oceans were a place of horror and uncontrolled chaos. So at the very start there, to talk about the Spirit of God moving over the face of the earth, really over the waters, let you know that God is in charge of the waters. It's not like the Phoenicians or the Philistines who believed in this god Baal, who was the lord of the storms and the sea. No, God moves over the face of the waters. He's in control of that. Now when we hit chapter 2, verse 5, it says something very different. Talking about when God made the heavens and earth, it said, when no bush of the field and no small plant had yet sprung up, for the Lord had not caused it to rain on the land, there was no man to work the ground. Genesis chapter 2, when it talks about creation, you get a picture where instead of the earth being this wasteland of water, it's a desert. There's no plants. There's nothing going on. Why? Because it hasn't started to rain yet. and there's no man to work the face of the earth. And you go, oh, that's strange. But there's a bigger purpose here. Because when's it going to start to rain? When's the first rainstorm? Noah. So when we talk about these introducing texts, all of a sudden you're getting foreshadowing here. Oh, when's it going to start to rain? Well, you don't see that with the story of Adam and Eve or the Tower of Babylon or anything like that. The rain starts with Noah. And then the second thing here, there was no man to work the ground. When is man going to have to start working the ground? After the fall. It's part of the curse. So right at the very start here, you're getting a very different picture. Genesis chapter 1, God creates, you got 6 days of creation and a day of rest, and after each one, God says it is good. Now at the very start of chapter 2, it's not a water, it's a desert, but then the second thing is, we're getting some really ominous overtones here. There's no rain yet, setting up Noah, and man hasn't started working the ground yet because the curse hasn't. You know, in other words, you're going, I don't like where this story's going in chapter 2. Then it talks about, then the Lord formed man from the dust of the ground, breathed into the nostrils the breath of life. And this is one of these things when we talk about cross-comparing with other texts that's very, very interesting. The first thing is, the Hebrew is making a word play here. When it talks about forming the man from the ground, the Hebrew there is ha-adam. And what does he make? He makes a man. And that's Adam. So you kind of say, you know, like, you're all my age, you know, like Gumby, the animated character, you know. Wasn't Gumby great? Yeah, I think they were taking LSD or something when they did those episodes because some of them are really weird. But it's like this clay figurine character. And that's what Adam is. He's this clay man that's formed from the earth. Now, the other thing that goes on here, when it talks about forming him, it uses this Hebrew verb, yasher. And this really becomes important because when we talk about looking at a text to understand it, one of the things we need to do is understand what we call frames. So if I walk into a restaurant and I look at the menu, what does that look like? What's a menu in a restaurant look like? Yeah, but how? What? Okay, yeah, because if I go into a fast food restaurant, where's the menu? It's up on the wall. If I go into a nice restaurant, where's the menu? It's in my hand. If I sit down at a computer, where's the menu? It's on the screen. And so you need to know the frame. Am I in a fast food, a nice restaurant, or am I at my computer? I need to know the frame, the context, to understand what the word's being used here. Now, we're going to have a couple frames here in Genesis chapter 2. The first one is Yosher, formed. Now, what's he forming? He's forming dirt into a man. And as I was saying, when we start looking at the text around during that time, we get really interesting things. Now, Genesis is probably written somewhere before, during, or slightly after Israel's exodus out of Egypt. This means that the Egyptian things become kind of important. Now, here we have an Egyptian temple here. We have the god Khnum on the left here. Can you see him on the left? I actually tried to boost the contrast and stuff because kind of a dusty brown wall. It's kind of hard to see the things. But he's there. And then look what he's got there in front of him. A little man, but what's the man on? He's on a pottery wheel. And then over to the left, we have Isis, and she has that Ankh symbol, which is the first glyph in the Egyptian word for breath. And she's holding the Ankh up to the little man's mouth. Now, this whole idea that God is a potter that forms man and then puts the breath of life into him is something that's throughout the Middle East. And it's a metaphor. They didn't actually think that, Khnum or Yahweh were making little clay figurines and then putting them in women, and then boom, out they come. It's a metaphor to understand what's going on there. But it's a widely used one. Here's one that and someone took and then colored in, so you can see once again Khnum on the left, and then the little individuals on the pottery wheel there. When it talks about God forming man out of clay, it's picking up these cultural metaphors and using it there. And then when it talks about that he breathed into the nostrils the breath of life, this whole idea of breath coming in and giving somebody life, theologically in the Old Testament, this sets the trajectory that life begins with breath and life ends with the expiration, where you expire, you expire, you breathe out your last breath. That's when life and death begin and end for the Old Testament. And this is then tied with this whole idea here. He says, he breathed into him the breath of life. In the Hebrew, this is the word ruach. And it means spirit, it means life, it means breath, what you breathe, and it also means wind. Because when you're trying to understand what gives somebody life, and you don't have wonderful medical personnel like my wife around to tell you, yes, Dave, you're still alive, you can live another day, get out of bed now. How do you tell if someone's alive or dead? Because you don't have stethoscopes, you don't have EKGs, you don't have anything like this. The most obvious way to see if someone's alive or not is by breath. How do you know if a baby's going to live after it's born? When it takes that first breath and lets out its scream. The baby's alive, yay, it made it, type thing. So it's a very, very physical type world that they live in. And then also when it talks about him breathed into him the breath of life, when they translated this verb to breathe into, it's the Greek verb infusio. I know. You're kind of like, I'll forget that, useless information. I don't know why Don pays this guy, type thing. But where this gets interesting is this is a very rare verb. Where we see it again is in John chapter 19, when Jesus is in the upper room. He says, peace I give, my peace be with you. And then it says he breathed onto them. And it's the same Greek word, he infusio, on them. And so the picture there that John picks up is right out of the Greek translation of the Old Testament. As God breathed life into Adam and made him alive. In the upper room, when Jesus breathed on the disciples, you have a new life. There's a new creation taking place here after the resurrection. And he breathes it onto them. Let's move on. And then the Lord planted a garden in Eden. Now we get a second frame. The first one was potter. The second one is a garden. And I hate this translation for the word garden because it misleads us. The first thing I want you to realize is Eden is not the garden. The garden is in Eden. Eden is a region and the garden is in it. The second thing is, when we think of a garden, we tend to think of like a big forest, a lush area or something like that. A better translation for this word would be orchard. He planted an orchard. And you're going to see how this frame of an orchard gets played out throughout the whole text here. He plants this orchard, and there he put the man who he formed. So he makes this orchard. Now, when we talk about orchard and doing literary archaeology and stuff like this, here's a mosaic off a wall in a tomb by Thebes. Now notice in the very middle of it, you've got this depiction of like a pool with fish in it. But the key thing is all the trees that are planted around it. If you're a wealthy king during that time, one of the big things you would want to do to show off your wealth was create these gardens. And this is where you would bring your guests. This was a luxury, and you would put water in it because the water through the evaporative process would cool it off. So if you're in a desert climate, to have a pool of water surrounded by trees, this would be a great place in the heat of the day while all your people are out working the fields or building things or doing whatever. You can enjoy the cool of it. This and another one, they would make these little tiny models that they would put in people's tombs when they bury them. Did you see the real little ones with all the people working the fields and stuff? Okay, you weren't in that museum. This one's from Thebes also. It's from the Boston Fine Arts Museum. And it's about this big, but the key thing is it's in this tomb, and it depicts an orchard or a garden that hopefully this person will have in their afterlife. They'll have this really blessed place where they can go and live. Now, how this comes across to us today, some 3,000 years later, is that it goes from the Hebrew word gan, and when it gets translated into the Greek, they use the word paradise. But paradise isn't a Greek word. They took this from the Babylonians, paradisias. It's a Babylonian word that the Greeks thought, oh, this is a cool idea. And so they brought it over into Greek. And going on here, talking about this garden, it says, and out of the ground God made spring up every tree that was pleasant to sight, good for food, and the tree of life was in the midst of the garden. Now, when we're talking about this orchard and all these trees that are growing up and various things like this, and God's presence is there, this gets picked up into the temple motif. So the Babylonian, the Assyrians, the Egyptians all would put in their temples all of these columns. But the key thing that we often miss about the columns is we don't look at the tops of them enough. So if we look at the tops of the columns, you'll notice that they have decorations at the top. And then here's one that's been colored in. When you would go into these, because these temples were painted, the paint flaked off over time. And so by finding little micro pieces of paint there, we can reconstruct what these things look like. And these columns were painted to look like trees. So if you were to go into Luxor or one of these temples and look around and you're in the temple with these colonnades, you're in the middle of a stylized forest. Why? Because this is luxury. This is where all these trees that God made and planted are, and this is where God's presence is. So you can kind of see how the Hebrews are playing off that, but the key thing for the Hebrews is they didn't build a temple like Luxor. Why? Because this is a story that tells us about our beginnings, and God doesn't dwell in a house built by hands. We have a temple that's for religious purposes, but that's not where God dwells. But once again, going into this whole idea of a tree. And then finally, the really big one is, it talks about a river flowing out of Eden to the garden, and there it divided and became 4 rivers. Now, the really big one for this is another one of these tablets. This one was found over in the region of Nineveh, and it's the cuneiform underneath it lets you know that this was the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. But you can see all of the trees in it. But the Babylonians took it a little bit further than the Egyptians. Egyptians didn't have to worry about a river. We got the Nile. So we're going to make little pools. The Babylonians out there in the middle of the desert, what they did up in the Assyria, they created an aqueduct about 150 miles long, 30 feet deep, about 70 feet wide, that brought water from the mountains down into the city of Nineveh so that they could make this garden for the king, Sennacherib. And in that garden, you'll notice it's got rivers running through it. So you can kind of see how it's picking up these ideas and moving forward. Now, the other thing that when it talks about these stories and why things like Assyria or Babylon are pretty important is because when we hit Abraham, where does Abraham come from? He comes from the region of Ur, which seems to be a shortening of Sumer. He comes from the region of Sumeria, where these like hanging gardens or things like this were built or made. So you see, as they start working off these texts, that Israel is interacting with using images, motifs, ideas, and metaphors from their culture, but they're comparing and contrasting with it. We don't build big gardens like King Sennacherib does. Why? Because we've lost access to the garden. We've been thrown out of it. Moving on a little bit further. Let's see how are we doing for time here. Maybe just a couple minutes. Yeah, this is important. Then God takes the man, and he put him in the Garden of Eden to work and to keep it. Now, these verbs, work and to keep. Let me see how much. Okay, so let's just focus on verse 15 now and there. Because you know the whole thing about not eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. You got that one down. That's pretty straightforward. Don't have to do that. The one before it, verse 2:15, he puts him in the garden to work and to keep it. The verbs here can talk about to protect and to care for, to watch over, or to observe these things. There's a wide latitude there. But if you're having someone and you put them in the garden and you give them a command, then these ideas of to working the garden and then to keep or to protect it are probably the ones that are most important. What would a caretaker in an orchard do? Type thing. Water, okay, watering them, okay. That would probably fall under the keeping or the working part of it, walking around with the water jug, you know. He probably had a really cool little, you know, gardening hat. That's about probably all that he wore. Well, definitely that, if he had that, that would be all he had on, because it talks about him being naked. The whole thing, as I was going to bring up, when we hit the point they were naked and unashamed, I was going to continue the story of George Smith there in the British Museum. But these two verbs become really important also, because these are the same verbs that get repeated perhaps the most once we hit Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And in fact, I took from today's service here, when we hit the Decalogue, the Ten Commandments, the second commandment says, "Thou shalt not make for thyself any graven image, nor the likeness of anything in the heaven above or the earth beneath." Oh, you go, oh, that's Genesis 1. You don't do that. Or the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or worship them. In the fourth one, it says, "Remember that thou shalt keep holy the Sabbath day." And this verb, keep the Sabbath, and it gets used, you shall keep all the Lord's commandments, is the same verb that's used here that God tells Abraham to keep the garden. And then the verb to work is this word for, it also gets translated as observe. You shall observe all my commandments. You shall serve the Lord your God and serve him only. So these verbs of to work and to keep have a wide range of meaning, but they get picked up throughout the rest, especially when you hit the law and the giving of the law from then on. I'm going to close there just because we've got about 5 minutes left, and there's no way I'm going to get through the whole lesson here today. I realize I put in way too much more than my time, but this is because I haven't taught up here recently, so my timing's completely off. But let's close there. If you have any questions or anything like that, we can go. The other thing I want to say is that the whole point here isn't to say, oh, if you hold to, let's say, a creationist viewpoint, what I've tried not to do is say this is not anti-creationist. And if you hold to like a theistic evolution type of point of view, it's not saying that that's wrong either. What I've tried doing is opening up the text and showing you aspects within the text so that it becomes fresh and provocative and speaks to you in new and hopefully exciting ways as we go into Lent. All right? All right. Yes, every Sunday through Lent. We're good up to Lent, right? I mean, up to Easter. Yes. Yeah. Okay, so if you have more questions or we want to talk more, we can talk over in the fellowship hall. But we need to go now, so